take that down. I can't have that in the pictures. I
No,
honestly, I've
okay,
looked
we'll
at it
just say,
6
we'll just
times.
say it. Yeah.
There's also a typo in my program. It says we're having lunch tomorrow at 12:30 a.m. And I had 6 people.
Oh,
that
yeah,
day.
good, good. Very-
If you could take it down for now. Is it supposed to say American Confederate?
Thanks. No, no, no.
Sorry about that.
It's a minor, minor.
A million moving parts. Okay.
Cool. We like to jump on it.
Thank you.
So when we start, I need to flip this up.
Flip it down. I know, I flipped it down and then he's controlling it.
People are still rolling in.
You guys are all matching, man. Looks good.
Good to see you.
You're matching us too.
Corey DeAngelis, this is my
Hey,
kid,
how's it going?
Steven, Daniel, Josh, Taylor, my wife Nicole.
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
He's going to be the Secretary of Education someday.
And then I'm gonna abolish the department, right?
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
See you yesterday.
This is going to be great. Fun to watch you all. So thanks for doing this.
Are you guys gonna?
We're going to go peek in, but we'll probably be back over here.
Cool.
So we want to see it.
All right. Thanks.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, of course. All right, we have so many people in here, we had to close the door. All right.
That's right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nathan Kaneen. I'm a communications associate with the American Federation for Children. For those of you who aren't familiar with who we are or what we do, we are the nation's largest school choice advocacy group. And we work every day to empower families and students by allotting them educational choice. I'm joined today with our National Director of Research, Corey DeAngelis, Press Secretary Walter Blanks Jr. Corey, how about you get us started this afternoon and just explain a little background, what's been going on in education over the course of the past year, and then perhaps even a little more broadly.
Yeah, cool. I'll just say thank you guys so much for the great turnout. This is fantastic that we have so many people in the room. I had to close the door to keep everybody from trying to break in. So yeah, thank you so much, and to the Western Conservative Summit for having us out to spread the message about educational freedom, or what most people call school choice. And what I've really talked about in terms of funding students as opposed to systems. I like to talk about in those terms for a couple of reasons. One is that it provides more clarity. When you say school choice, a lot of people are like, well, what exactly does that mean? So it's a benefit to say, let's fund the student directly, because it allows you to really understand what's happening. The money follows the child to wherever they're getting an education. That could be the government-run school if that works best for them, but if not, for whatever reason, you should be able to take your children's education dollars to a private school, a charter school, or a homeschool option. So Nathan, you asked a little bit about what happened over the past year and kind of to set the stage a little bit for this conversation. The title of this talk, if you haven't seen it already, is that, and this has been my take over the past year, the entire time, that COVID didn't break the public school system. In a lot of ways, it was already broken. The past year simply shined a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education in America, which happens to be a massive, long-existing power imbalance between the government school monopoly and individual families. It's one thing for a failing institution to continue to get your children's education dollars, regardless of how well they do, regardless of the satisfaction levels of the families, regardless of their choice, and regardless of their preferences. But it's another conversation altogether for that same building to continue to get your children's education dollars, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. Families were scrambling over this past year, and the public school system prioritized itself over the interests and needs of millions of families. Just think about it, right when the school closures happened in March of 2020, private schools all along were fighting to reopen, or they had been open the entire time. The government schools were fighting to remain closed. For example, in Kentucky, it's a good example. You had a Supreme Court, a case make its way all the way to the Supreme Court because private schools were fighting against Democratic Governor Andy Beshear's closure of public and private educational institutions. So the private schools fought all the way up to the Supreme Court for the right to provide services to families and their children. The Kentucky Education Association cheered Beshear's closure of schools. And we had examples of this all across the country. California, for example, there was a weird school closure order in Sacramento County, for example, that said it was okay to keep your doors open if you were a daycare service, but not if you were teaching. So some private school out there, a Catholic school actually, got pretty, they had a great idea to get around this absurd, arbitrary rule from the government, and they rebranded themselves as a daycare center. They actually retrained all of their employees as daycare workers and said, you know, this is just a daycare center and, you know, it looks like a school, but we're actually just providing some education on top of daycare services. And the Sacramento Health County official didn't really like that too much. They said, oh, you're just trying to get around the rules. Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing because the rules didn't make any sense at all. But that just goes to show you the difference between the two sectors. You had the public school monopoly teachers unions flooding into the streets. In DC, where I live, they put fake body bags outside the DC public school offices because their argument was, well, if you make me go back to work, that means you really just want to kill teachers. That was their argument. And they went as low as they could go. You didn't see that happening from other industries. You didn't see the grocery store workers doing that. You didn't see the private school workers doing that. And this isn't an argument against the people in the system. It's an argument against the failing system itself. I don't think that the people in other sectors or in the private sector are inherently better or more competent than the people in the public sector. I think the main difference is one of incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. And the best way to fix that problem, and we wouldn't have had all of these problems over the past year if we already had a system that funded individual students directly as opposed to closed public school buildings. If we had school choice, there would be bottom-up accountability for those institutions to actually listen to the needs of individual families. And so I think that's why we've seen over the past year what Walter has called the school choice wave. So could you talk a little bit, Walter, about what you mean on social media when you're talking about the school choice wave? Are we actually seeing additional support for school choice this year? Can you go over some of the polling and then also some of what's happened in state legislatures?
So a little tough to follow up Corey's opening line there, but about maybe 3 or 4 months ago, with the help of Corey, Twitter genius over here, we were trying to find kind of new catchphrases, hashtags to really capture what was going on in the education system. And school choice wave just all of a sudden came to me, and I think it's a perfect representation of what's really going on. Over the past year, we've seen more than a dozen states introduce various new school choice bills to expand existing programs. And the thing that's so interesting about it is that parents and families have woken up. The pandemic made parents realize that I could do a better job than what the public education system is doing. And I am number 2 of 6 kids. My mom has homeschooled the 4 after me, which I don't know how she did it, but when the pandemic happened, they didn't skip a beat. They kept going. They were a little upset because all their friends were outside playing, football and stuff like that, but they were on track. And so, and even now, even Corey's idea of funding students instead of systems is something that has taken root. I'm from the great state of Ohio, and there's been legislation introduced called the Backpack Bill, where it's that very exact same idea where the education dollars follows the child wherever they go. And when we get into this conversation a lot, especially at a very high level, we often talk of policy points, research points, and people like Nathan and I, who've both benefited from school choice programs from Florida, I'm from Ohio, the child is often left out in that conversation. And while these points are great, Corey does an excellent job. For those of you who follow him on Twitter know very well that he combats a lot of foolishness on Twitter. But one thing that Nathan and I have a unique perspective on is this is our experience. This is our life. And so, and to give a brief background about my investment and belief in this, I grew up in the inner city of Columbus, Ohio, 5 other siblings. And school was very, very difficult for me. I was bullied, and it just wasn't a good fit. But then you had my older brother who couldn't do any wrong. Like, he was the perfect son. And to this day, no matter how much no matter how much I do this work, I do all these really cool things, he's still the perfect child. I'm just like, I don't get it. But
Walter, I think you're perfect if that helps.
Thanks, Corey. But Thank you. But I often say that a desperate parent is a dangerous parent, and that's exactly what both my parents were in finding a place for me to succeed and to thrive. Because I mean, I'm average height, skinny. I didn't have D1, teams knocking on my door for a scholarship, or I wasn't going to the league, and so I had to figure out something. And with the scholarship in Ohio, I went to a private school, private Christian school, 6th grade all the way through. And that in those years, that's where my education, my learning became something special, right? I really took ownership of it. And there were times where I was waking up at 5:30 in the morning because we lived so far away. I was waking up my dad. I'm like, hey, like, I got to get to school. I can't be late. And so we often talk about, these policy points and all of these different things, but not very often people don't reflect about how is this work affecting the children, whether it's positive or negative. And so growing up, I had teachers tell me I wouldn't amount to anything. I would become another statistic. I had family members tell me I'd end up just like my dad, all these different things. And you fast forward a little bit, graduated high school, graduated college. 2 weeks after graduating college, moved out to DC, where I now work for AFC. Recently moved to Texas, but then even 6 months on the job, I look up and I'm sitting right next to President Trump talking about the importance of school choice and how the power of it.
Well, make everybody go follow him on Twitter and look at his pinned tweet. You'll see what he's talking about.
Yeah, so
What's your at?
At chosen114, and it's spelled with a Z. So CHOZENONE 14, and you guys can take a look at that. I'll leave a little tease so I won't, explain what happened.
So
Just if I could jump in real quick. Walter highlighted that one of our core beliefs here at AFC is making sure we highlight people's real lived experiences with school choice. And this is just such a great opportunity to plug. We have a database of over 700 what we call Voices for Choice stories. And these are written testimonies of parents or students who have directly benefited from school choice. But we also just recently added an advocate option. So if any of you are interested, visit our website and fill out a Voice for Choice story, and you will be published as an advocate in favor of funding students instead of systems.
And every story we publish, you guys get a $50 Amazon gift card. Yeah.
breaking the bank.
That is true.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too, to build on a little bit of what Walter was saying, that and tie it back into the conversation over the past year. I think more and more families are figuring out that there isn't any good reason to fund closed institutions, failing institutions, when you can fund the student directly instead. So just to go over some of our polling at American Federation for Children, we have a nationally representative poll that we partnered with Real Clear Opinion Research, and we found that between last spring and this spring, support for school choice jumped by 7 percentage points, from 64% support to 71% support. I had to make sure I got the math right in my head. I went to a government school, so take it easy. I think I got it right. But yeah, 7 percentage point jump. And the biggest jump in support, and other polls have found this as well, by EdChoice, Harvard University did a poll of America's youth, finding a 10 percentage point jump in support for school choice over the past 2 years. So we have 3 nationwide polls that have found this over the past year. And I think the best part about all of this is I think it's the teachers union's own doing. They've overplayed their hand and done more to advance the concept of school choice than anyone could have ever imagined. I'm a school choice advocate, and I work pretty hard at it every day. But you know what? I think Randy Weingarten beat me this year just because of all the nonsense that's happened. Does anybody remember the interpretive dance video by the Chicago Teachers Union? Look it up. Interpretive dance video, Chicago Teachers Union. They actually created a video, and they thought it was a good idea to post it on Twitter to protest reopening. And you just got to hear the music and everything. It's just, give me a break. I think I responded as well as Bethany Mandel from Ricochet that, is this a parody account? Like, are you guys actually doing this right now? I talked a little bit about the differences with like the response from the private and the public sector and daycares earlier. Another thing that I thought was just the weirdest that happened over the past year was there were public school districts. They were making the argument that it was not safe enough to return, although all of the scientific evidence, the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence, 130 studies that have been reviewed by someone at the American Enterprise Institute, you can look it up. The preponderance of the evidence suggests that schools can safely reopen without major increases in community transmission or hospitalizations of the virus. The evidence is pretty clear on that. But they argued it wasn't safe enough, and okay, they made that argument. But then they opened the same public school buildings for in-person childcare services. Wait, but if it's safe enough to do the daycare stuff, why isn't it safe enough to do the learning? Does the virus know that if you're learning something, it's going to turn on a certain, I don't know, chemical that'll make it more likely to spread? No, it's obviously because it's a difference in incentives between the two sectors. And what was really happening was that families were paying out of pocket for this in-person childcare service. And I was like, well, if we're already paying through the property tax system, why are families having to pay twice? What actually ended up happening in most of these places was they had private sector daycare employees from places like YMCA coming into the public school buildings while the public sector employees were staying at home and providing the virtual instruction. So you had two people doing the job of one, and families were the ones getting the short end of the stick. And just to reiterate what Walter alluded to earlier, is there were over 30 states that introduced bills to fund students directly. And at least 12 of those states have already gotten those bills signed into law. So at AFC and at other school choice advocacy groups, we're calling this the year of school choice. We have had so much success this year, and it's the fault of the teachers union. And thank you, Randy Weingarten and the American Federation of Teachers, for making the best case for school choice that we've ever seen in recent memory. I'd also like to talk a little bit about why I think it's so important to frame this in terms of funding students as opposed to systems. Talked about one of the points earlier, it's clarity. But then two, it puts the other side on defense. All of a sudden, they have to try to argue why we should fund the system and not the student. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a government monopoly. And hey, you're in the way of the American Federation for Children, support our work, but we should get our priorities right and put our money where our mouth is and fund the student as opposed to the institution. I think another reason why this is so important that we talk about this way is that we can introduce analogies to the conversation. That we already fund students directly with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives, including with higher education. We have the Pell Grant for low-income students and GI Bill, where the money goes to the student, and they can choose the public provider of university services that they want, but you can also take that money to a private, religious, or non-religious university, and no one really has an issue with that. With pre-K services, we have the federal Head Start program and other taxpayer-funded pre-K programs. The money rightfully goes to the family, and then they can choose public or private, religious or non-religious providers of pre-K services. It's only when it comes to K through 12 education where the other side gets all up in arms and upset. We can continue the analogy with other sectors of the economy. We have food stamps. Everybody in here would think it would be absolutely ridiculous if we forced low-income families to take their food stamp dollars to residentially assigned government-run grocery stores. That wouldn't make any sense. We can debate all day about how much we should spend with these types of programs, but if we're going to spend the money, we might as well fund the person and let them choose Walmart, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, like we do with all of these other programs. We should just apply the same logic to K through 12 education. The problem is a difference of power dynamics. Choice is the norm with groceries and higher education and pre-K, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest that profits from getting your children's education dollars regardless of how well they do, regardless of your choice in the matter, and as we've seen over the past year, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. So they fight really hard against allowing any change from that system. They fight to protect the system at the expense of the students and their families. How much time do we have left? I wanted to hit on school choice myths as well, but I also do want to open it up for questions in a little bit.
We're doing very well on time. If you'd like to, both of you address, Walter always says that there's a lot of nonsense in this area, a lot of myths about school choice that have been overwhelmingly debunked, mostly by Corey. So if you guys wouldn't mind sharing a main argument against school choice and then the reason why it's incorrect.
Well, I'll let you deal with one of the easy ones, of course. One thing, especially in communities that I come from, we often hear that parents aren't educated enough to make the best decision for their child, and that a parent who's working 3 or 4 jobs has no way of knowing if a school is a good fit or not. And this one just makes me laugh because I remember the first public school that I went to. We walked into it, and my mom was like, "Oh no, like this is just not going to work." And I was like, "How does she know that?" And sure enough, within a couple weeks, I was suspended. And so, understanding that conversation, and I think honestly, to be candid, it's very condescending, and it's most of the time coming from people who don't live in those communities, don't have those experiences. And so it's like, how are you going to make a decision about my life, my community? You won't even take the time to visit the schools. You won't even take the time to come into these communities. And so there will be times where my mother, she's a huge fan. I'm not the perfect child, but she still supports me. And I'll send her an article about something that's going on in Ohio, and I say, yeah, take a look at this. And like, she's like, that's absolutely insane that people actually think that. And she's been inspired, and she's working to form kind of a parent union in Ohio. But it's just understanding the fact that no one knows the child best than the parents. Period. Point blank. And so we support and fight for the fact that, and the idea that, let's just give them all the opportunity, all of the resources, and just go play in the sandbox. Go make the best decision for your kids. So like, often in the movement, we see people arguing about curriculum or what should be taught and what shouldn't be taught. I'm just like, I don't care. As long as a parent is happy where their child's at and that child is thriving and succeeding and doing well, like then our job is done. And if they're in a school where things are being taught that they don't like, they should be able to take their education dollars and go elsewhere.
Yeah, it's excellent takedown of that myth. And I'll just add that, look, at the end of the day, families aren't always going to make a perfect decision, but the government doesn't make perfect decisions most of the time. So families in general are going to have more information and on-the-ground knowledge and incentives to get the decision right about their own children than bureaucrats sitting in offices thousands of miles away. And at the end of the day, that's one of the strongest arguments for school choice, that families are going to get this decision right more often than the government bureaucrats that are far from perfect themselves. You said you're going to allow me to do the easy myth, and this is the one that everybody's heard 1,000 times. Every time a school choice bill is introduced, raise your hand if you've heard it. School choice sounds okay and all, but this is just going to steal money from the public schools. Anybody hear that? Everybody over here. Everybody online, you better be raising your hand as well, because everybody's heard this. And it's interesting that the main argument against school choice is actually the main argument for school choice. If your knee-jerk reaction to allowing families to choose is, oh my goodness, my establishment is going to break down, that is an argument against the establishment. What does that tell you about their confidence in the product that they're providing to families? Why would giving families a choice defund public schools? If they're doing a good job, it's because they understand that a lot of families aren't happy with the services that are being provided by the K-12 government education system. So they feel like they need to force families to stay there. And what's interesting here is that not all families are forced to stay in this failing system. It's disproportionately the least advantaged families. So school choice is an equalizer in the same way, in that it allows more families to access alternatives. Advantaged families, at least, are more likely to have school choice already. They're more likely to be able to live in the neighborhoods that are just happen to be residentially assigned to the best government schools. They're more likely to be They're more likely to be able to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. So funding students directly allows for more equity as well by allowing more families to access these alternatives. But to get back to the defunding public schools myth, would anyone ever say that allowing families to choose their grocery store defunds Safeway? That just wouldn't click. Like, you would say, are you okay? Do I need to take you somewhere? Because why are you talking like this? It doesn't make any sense. And the reason why that would sound so absurd is because everybody in here and in general understands that that money doesn't belong to Safeway. Similarly with K-12 education, that money doesn't belong to the government schools. It belongs to the kids and their families. The whole point of the education system is supposed to be about educating children and providing for their needs, not the other way around. It's supposed to be about the kids, not the employees in the system. So the way that I would respond to is that school choice doesn't defund public schools. Public schools defund families. School choice initiatives just return the money to the hands of the rightful owners. It never should have belonged to the government schools in the first place. It's not theirs. My second response is school choice doesn't defund public schools. Public schools defund themselves when they fail to meet the needs of families year after year. You wouldn't lose any students if you were providing adequate services to them. When they're given the option to leave, they would stay with your institution. My third response to that is a technical point, and that's usually the boring response, but it's an important one because public schools, as we all know, are mostly paid for, funded by enrollment counts. You have more students, you get more money. You lose some students, you lose some money. But they're not completely funded based on enrollment counts. In Texas, for example, where I grew up, about 2/3 of the funding is based on enrollment counts. What does that mean about the last third of the funding? You lose a student, you only lose 2/3 of the funding. That means you get to keep 1/3 of the funding, and you have higher per pupil revenues when you lose your students to your competition. In what other industry do you lose your customers and you financially benefit? It's just imagine if a private school got to keep 1/3 of your tuition dollars each year, even after you switched to another school. They would be happy with that deal. Just imagine if Walmart got to keep 1/3 of your grocery bill each week, even after you started shopping at Safeway. That wouldn't make any sense, but that's how the funding formulas exist in the current K-12 public school system. And the reality is that public schools actually financially benefit on a per pupil basis in response to school choice programs. So they should be happy they get to keep any money at all for students they're no longer educating. But the main point is, look, it doesn't belong to you. This money is for the children. It should follow them to wherever they're getting an education. I think we should open it up to questions because we do have a good amount of time left, but we have a packed house. And, we can sit here and ramble all day, but I really want to hear about what you guys want to hear about. So let's pass around the mic and get some questions. I've been talking too much.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. This is really interesting. I have two questions. I'm going to hog it a little bit. One is, an argument against choice is that we can't commingle public tax dollars with private or parochial schools. So that's one question. The other one is, can you give us some examples of states or localities that have been successful in getting school choice implemented?
So I'll take the first, Walter will take the second. The first argument is in one way or another that you can't have school choice because these are public dollars going to private religious institutions, and this in some way is a problem with the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And my response is that, well, I wonder if these same people make the same argument against Pell Grants. Pell Grants can be used at Notre Dame. They don't make that argument. They never will make that argument because it's not about the logic and morality of the policy. It's about power dynamics. The Pell Grant doesn't threaten an entrenched special interest that gets that money regardless of the choice of the college student. It only works out that way with K-12. My other response is, so I just like to call them out on their hypocrisy for saying this, but not. Food stamps you can use to pay for food that ultimately gets used at religious services, and that's okay. Social Security dollars are public dollars that can be used to pay for private religious school tuition, even at the K-12 level. So we have all these other Medicaid dollars can be used at religious hospitals. That's not a problem, and no one ever says anything about any of these other things. And the reason for that and why it is constitutional, and it's not an infringement or a violation of the Establishment Clause, is because the money goes to the individual, and the individual has a choice in religious and non-religious options. So with Pell Grants, I can choose a non-religious university if I'd like. With food stamps, I can choose to not use the food ultimately at a religious gathering. With Medicaid dollars, I can choose the non-religious hospital. Same with K-12 education. You're not forced to use the funding at a religious K-12 educational institution. You can use it at a non-religious institution as well. And so the primary beneficiaries of these programs are the families, not the schools. It's not a direct subsidy from the government to a religious institution. And there have actually been some recent Supreme Court case that even say if there is a direct subsidy from the government, it's still okay in some cases. For example, the Trinity Lutheran case, for example, it had to do with playground mulch. It wasn't for a religious purpose, but it did go to a religious institution. We also have Supreme Court case precedent when it comes to K-12 voucher programs. In Ohio, I believe, the Zellman versus Simmons-Harris case in 2002 was about a voucher program in Ohio, and the same argument was made, but it was held by a 5-4 decision that their voucher program out there did not violate the Establishment Clause because families could use the funding at religious or non-religious institutions, and the primary beneficiary is the family. And we just had the Montana versus Espinoza decision in 2020 that ruled with Chief Justice Roberts saying that a state need not subsidize private education, but once it's, okay, now it's getting to be a paraphrase, but once it does so, it cannot exclude schools solely on the fact that on the basis that they are religious schools, because it would violate the free exercise clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. I would argue it's also discriminatory against religious families and religious institutions to not allow voucher funding to go to follow children to a religious institution. There's actually another case that's going to go to the Supreme Court next week. On Thursday, they're going to convene to decide whether to take up the case. But Maine has a private school voucher program that can only be used at private, non-religious institutions. Even though Espinoza just ruled that that was a problem, the First Circuit Court of Appeals ruled with Maine and not the family. So that I think that's going to go up to the Supreme Court, and they're just going to make a similar ruling to the Espinoza case. But there's clear precedent that this is not a problem. Basic logic, thinking about these other programs, tells you it's not a problem either. Yeah, I think that's my full response to that. And then what the second question was?
Examples of states that have really good school choice programs, correct? Okay, I'm gonna give you two. I was gonna mention Ohio, just because it's my hometown, but you've given enough credit. Two states, Wisconsin has the oldest voucher program in the country. I think it's 31 years old now, I think. And then also in Florida, don't get too excited, Nathan, because I know whenever I mention Florida, you get excited. Wisconsin has a voucher program, and in Florida, it's a tax credit scholarship, and they serve almost 200,000 students who take advantage of that. And Corey, I was a little surprised you didn't mention this. He's done multiple studies, research about the effects of school choice and within districts. And more often than not, we see when a school is introduced into a district, all of the surrounding private or public schools start to perform better as well. Not all of them, but as a collectively. And so the idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. And so exactly. Competition breeds excellence. If Nathan, who we just hired, starts speaking a little bit better than I am, right? I won't complain that it's not fair. I figure out how to get better than them, right? And so it's definitely a model that I think should be encouraged within the public education system. And like Corey said earlier, if kids are thriving and parents are happy, they're not going to leave, even if you present them with a whole lot of different options, because it's working. And so school choice really is only for the parents who are not happy and want something more for their child.
And just to add on to that a little bit, there have been 28 studies on the subject of private school choice competition on what happens in the students who remain in the public school system. 26 of the 28 studies find statistically significant positive effects of the private school choice competition on the kids who don't even use the program, who remain in the public schools, because competition is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And so you don't even have to use the programs to benefit from it, because the public schools start to think like, well, if I don't want to lose that 2/3 of the funding, well, maybe I should up my game a little bit and do a better job. And so they start to respond by reallocating resources more towards the classroom, which is another important point. A lot of people will say, if you're for school choice, you must be anti-teacher. Well, first of all, there are teachers in the private school sector too. But then two, look at what the teachers unions have lobbied for decade after decade, and what these policies have led to for teachers in the traditional system. For example, between 1992 and 2014, this is in a report called Back to the Staffing Surge by Kennesaw State University professor Ben Scafferty. Over that time period, inflation-adjusted per pupil education expenditures in the public school system increased by 27%. But real teacher salaries, after adjusting for inflation over the same time period, anybody want to guess how much they raised the teacher salary? So the overall expenditures per pupil increased by 27%. Teacher salaries? Really close, actually, really close. They actually dropped by 2%. So we're pouring more and more money into the system, and the teachers aren't really seeing it in their paychecks. So when I hear teachers in the public school system complain about having to dig into their pockets to pay for supplies, I kind of feel bad for them because we aren't allocating resources towards the classroom. They're not seeing a lot of it. It's going towards more support staff and administrative bloat, which benefits teachers' union bosses, but doesn't benefit individual teachers on the ground doing the work. So there have been 5 studies that I know of, and don't take my word for it. Go to a blog at the Washington Examiner called School Choice Benefits Teachers Too. I summarized the research on this. 5 studies I know of on the topic find that school choice competition, either through charter schools or private schools, lead to higher salaries in the public school system. So you hear, oh, this is anti-teacher, but the public schools start to allocate more resources where it matters the most in the classroom with the teachers in response to competition. So school choice literally benefits everybody except for the bosses in the teachers' unions, because they just want more people in the buildings, which means more union dues paying members and more political power in numbers. But you could also spend that money on individual teachers who are already in the system, which would lead to higher teacher salaries over time. So we should get to more questions. I rant too much, so sorry.
This will be quick. I'm the legislative director for the Colorado House Republicans. Just curious, just moving in the direction of Ohio and other states like that, where can Colorado, in your opinion, kind of successfully move towards that kind of system? Or, you know, House Bill 21-1295 this year was a huge bill across the nation that we saw everybody push back against. It was a bill to basically outlaw charter schools in Colorado. So where can we, obviously that was pushed back against hard, where can we move in the other direction now?
Yeah, I think you want to keep expanding charter schools. I'm not intensely familiar with the charter school law, but allowing for more authorizers is always a good move. Equalizing funding between the sectors in the charter school sector. So real quick, definition of charter school, it's a public school by definition that can be privately operated and money follows the child if they want to attend those schools. But in Denver, I've done some research on this at the University of Arkansas with a professor named Patrick Wolf, and we found using the latest data that the charter school kids in Denver received about 20% less than the kids in the traditional schools, which begs the question, why do we value kids less just because their residentially assigned school didn't work for them? So one thing you can fight for as well is just equity in funding between sectors. Why should you lose funding associated with your child just because that residentially assigned option wasn't a good option? The teachers unions want to defund the charter schools, so that's why they call for these things, and they'll make arguments as to why they deserve less money, but each child should get the same amount of money. So you can really turn it around on the Democrats, I think, in making an equity argument for school choice by equalizing funding. And then when it comes to private school choice, let's face it, it should be a bipartisan issue. If you look at all these other programs where we fund people and you can take that money to a private institution, religious or otherwise, if we were logically consistent, you'd have bipartisan support on all of these things. But the reality is the power dynamics differ, where with the teachers unions, they disproportionately donate to one party. It makes it a lot less likely that party's going to vote in favor of a school choice initiative. So if you don't have a majority Republican legislature, which you don't in Colorado, it might be more of an issue. But I think more of a long-term play could be if Republicans start by making school choice a voting issue, much like abortion or gun rights. The thing that if you're a Republican, you better vote for this thing. I think Republicans should do that, and it's a perfect wedge issue because if you look at the polling on this, the majority of Democrat voters support charter schools and private school choice initiatives. Same thing with Republicans and independents. And what that will do is make Democrats feel like they have to take, they'll feel a little bit different pressure. Because right now, if they don't have, if they're, what they would like to do on the other side, on the Democrat side, would be to not take a side either way. Because if they come out in favor of school choice, the unions aren't going to like them. And that's not going to be politically profitable. But if they come out against school choice, a lot of families who would otherwise vote for them might say, I really like this charter school for my kid, and I'm going to make that my voting issue. And they might lose voters that way. And if they start to realize that Republicans are stealing voters through school choice, the Democrats might start voting in favor of it too. It's more of a long-term play, but I mean, just look at what happened with the governor's race in 2018. Governor DeSantis, the Wall Street Journal made the argument that school choice moms were the ones that set him over the edge to actually win, because as Walter said, Florida's a huge school choice state with private school choice initiatives. They have over 100,000 students using scholarships out there. And they're disproportionately, if you look at the average income of students using that scholarship program, it's about $27,000 per household. And so families who might have otherwise voted for a Democratic candidate might have voted in larger numbers for Governor DeSantis. So I think Republicans have a really great opportunity to make this a wedge issue, and then maybe Democrats will come on board later on, and it'll truly be a bipartisan issue when we look at the actual votes in state houses. I will say one other state that's really great is Arizona. Arizona is huge when it comes to school choice. They have about a fifth of their market share is charter school students. So they have a huge unregulated charter school sector, a lot of competition out there. And then West Virginia just passed the most expansive education savings account program in the nation. Over 90% of families are going to be eligible for an education savings account where you can take your child's state funding. If you don't like the public school for whatever reason, and you can use it for private school, homeschool, tutoring, instructional materials, any government-approved education expenditure. And so West Virginia went from 0 to 100 in just a couple of years. They didn't have any they still don't have any charter schools that are open in West Virginia, and they didn't have any private school choice programs until this year. So this is another data point showing that the teachers unions really overplayed their hand, and unions otherwise have a lot of sway in states like West Virginia. So again, thank you so much. Teachers unions, you were the true heroes this past year. But let's open it up to another question for sure.
Thank you. You've given a very good information. Just a couple of things. In Colorado, our property taxes, the rates are starting to skyrocket. The majority of our property taxes goes to our school system. So by default, our schools are going to get quite a bit more money just because of the dynamics there. I also have a little bit of a dilemma that I'd like for you to address. In Colorado, our state legislature has decided to get involved in curriculum. They control a lot of the purse strings for public schools. And I do not know the percentage of what the state budget is that goes towards public schools. I want to say it's close to 49–50% of our state budget. When the legislature gets involved in curriculum, they mandate it for the schools that receive tax dollars. Could you please address that? Because some of the mandates that they have with those tax dollars to me are onerous, i.e. sex education. Could you please talk to that? Thank you.
Yeah, I will say this is another one of the strongest arguments for school choice that we have as conservatives, right? And this is another thing where families woke up over the past year. One of the things was, look, this closed building's still getting the money while I'm homeschooling my kid, but that doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't the money follow the child? If my grocery store doesn't open, I could take the money elsewhere. If my school doesn't open, I should certainly be able to take the money elsewhere. But one of the blessings of remote learning is families started to get to see some of the stuff that was going on in the classroom. And part of it was just incompetence on the part of the lessons. Anybody see that viral video where the teacher was trying to say something about the Electoral College, and they said there was just a secret it was just like a secret society where they made like decisions, and there was just a horrible answer about what the electoral college was. So families were saying that, well, this isn't the kind of education I want for my child. But then two, they started to see a lot of the political stuff getting introduced into the classroom that just didn't rub them in the right way. I'm on Twitter too much, but one of the things that happened was there was a public school teacher out of the Philadelphia area, right when remote learning was starting over a year ago. This teacher went onto social media and said, you know what, teachers, it's great that we're not going back to in-person instruction and all, but the conservative teachers are going to see what we're teaching. Oh no, this is a huge problem. And families saw that, and they didn't rub them the right way. It raised a lot of red flags. One, because families should be part of these in these conversations. It's their kids, not the government's. And two, yeah, families just got to see that this was going on. That's why we're seeing so much of the school board fights over the past year as well. And I think that's a great option as well, to take over the school boards again and to fight back, because for a long time, I think the right hasn't been really well represented in school board races. So that's another way to help. But at the same time, you can have the right school board in play, and then the teachers could just still do whatever they want in a lot of cases. It's hard for true accountability to come through a school board. And how long is that going to take? And how much time do children have before they're indoctrinated by the other side? The better solution, I think, is to have the money follow the child, because then one, it's quicker, you can escape right away. And then two, it's the best form of accountability. I would argue the only true form of accountability that we have is the ability to vote with our feet, to take our money elsewhere. Still do the school board fights, that's important. But at the same time, use this as an argument for school choice. I don't care what your take is on any of these things that are being introduced to the classroom. I think we can all agree, though, if a family thinks that what's being taught does not align with their values, they shouldn't have to pay for that. And two, they shouldn't have to send their kid to a school where they feel like they're being brainwashed in values that are not aligned with the family. So I think school choice is not a perfect solution. There are no perfect solution. There are no silver bullets or only trade-offs, but I think it's the best solution that we have available. I don't know if I completely addressed your question. You might have been getting into how will this go into the private schools too if they accept taxpayer dollars? Is that kind of the question? So this is kind of a libertarian argument that you don't want to take the government money because then you'll have to do what the government says. And my response to that is that's true, but we don't want to make perfect the enemy of the good, because the alternative for a lot of the students is that they're stuck in highly regulated government schools that aren't doing much of a good job with educating children, period. So even if the private schools are a bit regulated, it's better than the complete regulation that's introduced in the government school system. Two, it's still voluntary. Private schools have the choice every single year to accept the funding or not. Individual families have the choice every single year to accept the funding or not. And so every single family should have the ability to make that cost-benefit decision. And if the regulations are too onerous, you should absolutely be able to, and every program allows you to do this, be able to say no. And a lot of programs that are more heavily regulated, the private school participation rates are a lot lower. In Louisiana, for example, they have a lot of onerous regulations, such as you have to accept all students at random, you can't control your admissions, you have to give that over to the government. You have to have state standardized tests, which a lot of parents don't like when schools teach to the test, so that's another onerous requirement. And then three, you have to accept the voucher amount as full payment. So let's say your tuition is $15,000 and the voucher is only $10,000, the school has to accept the voucher of $10,000 as full payment, even if the parent could have gotten a private scholarship another way to make up the difference. So a lot of those schools just said, no, I'm not going to participate. In Louisiana, only a third of the schools participated, whereas in less regulated programs, we have about double that participation rate. But ultimately, I think it should be up to the individual schools and families to make that decision. And at the same time, we should argue for unregulated programs, that we should allow private schools to be private. We shouldn't introduce these onerous regulations because a lot of times they just backfire. It turns out that a lot of schools will just not participate, and then that means fewer options for kids. So if you reduce those regulatory costs, you can have more success in the long run. It's not a perfect solution. I'll say that. But I think because it's voluntary, it's better than what we got.
Sorry. I know in a number of the Northern European countries, Sweden and the Netherlands particularly, where I've spent time, the school choice is enormously successful. And I was wondering, do you guys look into that at all? Is there any kind of modeling with those Northern European countries that could be at least as a good example, or something that could sort of bolster that here?
Yeah, someone who does really great work on this is a Johns Hopkins University professor, Ashley Berner. I think she has a book on, she calls it educational pluralism, and she points out how all of these other countries, which are typically less free than us and have fewer individual liberties than in the United States, have a lot more liberty when it comes to education. And some of these places are Sweden. They have a voucher program. The evidence is, the preponderance of the evidence is in favor of the voucher program in Sweden. And then there's also Finland. So in education circles, you know, it's kind of one of those things where everybody knows that everybody lifts up Finland on a pedestal. But what's interesting is the other side will say, oh, we should be more like Finland. And what that means is we just need to spend more money on education, even though overall they spend less than us per student. Just for everybody here and online, we spend, the latest data just came out of the US Census Bureau for 2019. I don't even want to see it for 2021 with all these American Rescue Plan and all the congressional injections that were supposed to be about reopening schools. But then in the Senate, when a Republican senator introduced an amendment to make that funding contingent upon actually reopening the schools, it failed on a 50-50 vote, completely partisan vote. But if it was about reopening the schools, then why couldn't the funding be based on reopening schools? It's because it never really was about safety and reopening the schools. It was about a power play by the unions. The entire school reopening debate has been more about politics and power dynamics than safety and the needs of families, but that's another conversation altogether. But Finland has a nationwide school choice system. It's more of like a nationwide charter school type of idea, but you're not residentially assigned to your schools and you can choose your school. But a lot of the people who say we should be more like Finland, they just put the blinders on when you point out, oh, well, they have nationwide school choice there. So I think just pointing out that other countries have more freedom than us in education, especially when a lot of the people who don't support school choice here will point to these countries and say, we should be more like these countries in all these other areas. Like we should, everybody, you know, Bernie Sanders, what are his favorite? Denmark, right, and Sweden. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, we should do that when it comes to education, but then I think it's valuable to point those things out. And at AFC, we don't do a lot of international stuff besides just pointing out, hey, you know, we should allow for more freedom in education too.
I was wondering how this funds following the students affect the homeschoolers. We did homeschool our daughter before it was the thing to do. And we got no money, of course. And there were certain regulations. I am from Arizona. They have since taken the regulations off. So if the parents are homeschooling, what accountability do they have that the use of the money is going toward the education of the student and the accountability that the student is actually learning something?
Yeah, I will say in general, the families are going to make these decisions better than the government. So I think the accountability is built into the fact that families have the best interests of their kids in mind. But I know that's not the answer that you're looking for. But in places like Arizona, they actually do have top-down accountability mechanisms where the funding has to be spent on government-approved education expenditures. So I can't just go next door and go to a super expensive restaurant with my voucher, for example. And so it has to be spent on education related activities. For homeschoolers, I will say, if you would like homeschoolers to be able to take advantage of education alternatives, I think the best type of program we have available is an education savings account. So everybody's heard of the voucher idea, where the money that would have followed you to the public school, you would take that in the form of a voucher to pay for private school tuition and fees. Usually you can't use that for homeschooling expenses like tutoring or other type micro schools, for example, or pandemic pods that we've seen over the past year. But education savings accounts do allow for that. And so the government approves those expenditures, and if there's fraud, then the parents get in trouble for that. And I will say there has been an evaluation of the Arizona Education Savings Account program, and I think they found a fraud rate of like 1%, whereas like the National School Lunch Program, the fraud rate is like 10 times that amount. So you're not going to get to a perfect 0% fraud rate, right? But we've seen that these programs have significantly lower fraud rates than other government taxpayer-funded initiatives. And let's be real, there's a lot of fraud that happens in the public school system too. I just trust the parents to be better arbiters of that money than bureaucrats. Anytime you want to take this from me.
You made a very compelling argument for school choice, and I would suspect that everyone in this room believes in that. How do you deal, and we know the unions are one of the major fundraisers for the Democrat Party. So how do you deal with, for example, in school board elections, where they funnel thousands and thousands of dollars to their candidates to get their candidates to win on the school board? So how do you deal with that? Because the unions are very powerful. They have a lot of money, in spite of the fact that the Supreme Court recently ruled that you don't have to join the union. But let's face it, teachers can be harassed and pressured, right, to follow the line. So how do you deal with all of that money, millions and millions of dollars going to their candidates running for school board?
Yeah, I do like Rebecca Friedrich's work on this. She was actually a public school teacher in California, and she has a book called Standing Up to Goliath, where she talks about how even though you're allowed to opt out of the union, there's all these bullying tactics and whatnot. And the Supreme Court case you're talking about is the 2018 Janus decision that says that you can't be forced to pay union dues. So that if we can get the message out about the Janus decision and email teachers and have a public relations kind of campaign on this, and some organizations are doing this, our organization is not. If more teachers know about this, they can be more likely to opt out of the union. So that could decrease the power of the union there. But then too, you're right, they do have a ton of power, and they're funded through the tax system. They have a ton of money. We spend over $740 billion on K-12 education each year in the public sector alone. There isn't a simple solution, but I will say the best shot that we have is, look, the teachers unions are a powerful interest group. We need to create a new interest group. And I think families can be that interest group. And we're seeing that in the school board election races and school board meetings all across the country right now. Parents are fired up. If we can capitalize on that fire that the parents are feeling right now and mobilize parents, they can push back. And they can push for new school board candidates. They can push for school choice. I think that's the best solution. And they can push for more transparency and accountability. And I think families need to stick up for their children. And I think we're seeing a lot of that right now, and I'm happy about it. And I think at the end of the day, they're gonna be able to fight a lot harder than the unions. Even though they're not as well funded, they care a lot more about their own kids than the unions do. And there's a lot more parents than people in the public school system, employees. So if we capitalize on this moment, and I think now's the time to do it, I think that's how we push back. And ultimately, you empower that special interest even more when you have the dollars following the child. We saw it play out in Florida. Because they had so many people using the program, that's a new special interest group that arguably helped Governor DeSantis win the governor's race. So it's not an easy solution, not a perfect solution. I mean, it's hard to fight against the unions, but we have better arguments. We have morality on our side, and we have the interest of the children on our side. They're sticking up for the employees and not doing a good job at it, and we're sticking up for the kids. And look, the system is supposed to be designed to serve the kids, not the other way around. So I think we can win this.
Absolutely. With that, we are indeed out of time. If anybody has any remaining questions, any of the three of us would be more than willing to speak with you and try to address those. We want to thank you for your time and your attention today. Hopefully, we all learned something.